Picture this: a shadowy figure standing at the crossroads of justice and myth, his axe glinting under the pale moonlight. To the outside world, he's the executioner, a man feared and shunned, his very name whispered with dread. But in the hushed stories passed down through generations of villagers, he's something else entirely: a protector, a healer, even a folk hero. How did someone so reviled by society become the heart of local legends? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. Across medieval Europe, executioners were outcasts, forced to live on the edges of towns, their hands considered too stained to touch the same bread as their neighbors. They carried out the grim orders of kings and courts, yet in the quiet corners of forgotten villages, something extraordinary happened. These same figures began appearing in tales, not as monsters, but as wise men who knew the secrets of herbs, as guardians who stood between villagers and the supernatural, or even as tragic heroes who bore the weight of justice so others wouldn't have to. The very people society pushed away became the ones folklore lifted up. What caused this astonishing shift? Was it the strange duality of their roles, both feared and necessary, that sparked the imagination? Or did villagers, living in a world where death was ever present, find comfort in reshaping the executioner's story into something more hopeful? As we journey through these forgotten legends, you'll hear how fear slowly twisted into fascination, how whispers of the gallows gave way to songs of salvation. These stories aren't just about the past, they're about how communities make sense of the unthinkable, turning darkness into light, one tale at a time. So let's step into the world where history and myth collide, and discover how the executioner's axe became a symbol not just of endings, but of unexpected redemption. To understand how executioners became folk heroes, we first need to grasp the strange, contradictory world they inhabited. These men, and occasionally women, occupied a unique social space in medieval communities. Officially, they were servants of justice, carrying out the will of rulers and courts, but in daily life they were treated as untouchables, literally and figuratively. Many towns forced them to live outside city walls, required them to carry identifying marks like special gloves or axes, and even banned them from entering churches. Shopkeepers would lower coins into vinegar before handing them to an executioner, afraid direct contact might spread spiritual contamination. Yet despite this ostracism, their skills made them indispensable. Beyond executions, they served as medieval Switzerland neutral parties called upon for tasks no one else would touch. When plague struck, they disposed of bodies. When a prisoner needed interrogation, they applied their knowledge of anatomy to extract confessions without killing. Surprisingly, many also became skilled healers, their intimate understanding of the body making them sought after bone setters and wound treaters, especially among the poor who couldn't afford proper physicians. This medical role planted early seeds of their folkloric transformation. How could someone who mended broken limbs by day and broke necks by night be purely evil? The executioner's paradoxical existence created fertile ground for myth-making. Villagers might publicly scorn them but privately rely on their services, breeding uneasy fascination. In an age where justice was often arbitrary, the executioner became a screen onto which people projected their fears about power, mortality, and morality. Some legends even claimed executioners possessed supernatural abilities, that they could cure rabies with a touch or banish evil spirits with their axes. These stories weren't just fanciful tales, they were a coping mechanism, a way for communities to reconcile their dependence on someone they'd otherwise shun. What's most revealing is how executioners themselves navigated this duality. Historical records show many took pride in their professionalism, seeing themselves as upholders of order rather than mere killers. Some kept detailed journals about the ethics of their work, while others donated to churches despite being barred from entering them. This tension between society's disgust and the executioner's own sense of purpose would eventually give rise to something extraordinary, not just tolerance but reverence. In the next chapter of their story, we'll see how these marginalized figures climbed from society's gutters into the realm of legend, one paradoxical tale at a time. One of history's most fascinating contradictions lies in the executioner's unexpected second act, not as an agent of death, but as a healer. While their day job required intimate knowledge of how bodies broke, many executioners quietly applied that same expertise to mend rather than end lives. In an era when physicians often relied on guesswork and superstition, these outcasts possessed something priceless: hands-on understanding of anatomy gained through grim necessity. When a child dislocated an arm or a farmer shattered a leg, villagers faced a choice: wait for a university-trained doctor who might never come, or swallow their fear and knock on the executioner's door after dark. The treatments they offered were surprisingly advanced. Some executioners became renowned bone setters, their experience with joints and ligaments making them adept at resetting fractures. Others specialized in wound care, using herbs and poultices to prevent infections, knowledge possibly gained from observing how different execution methods affected the body's decay. A few even dabbled in early surgery, removing tumors or treating fistulas with precision that rivaled royal physicians. Records from 16th century Germany describe an executioner who successfully operated on cataracts using a needle, a procedure most doctors of the time considered impossible. What's truly remarkable is how these medical roles became intertwined with their public image. Many executioners kept dual ledgers, one for executions, another for healing, with some medical journals surviving as treasured village heirlooms. In Austria, the personal notebook of executioner Franz Schmidt detailed over 14,000 treatments alongside his official duties, revealing a man who measured his worth not in lives taken, but in pain alleviated. This duality sparked whispers that executioners possessed forbidden knowledge, their healing touch tinged with magic. Some legends claimed they could stop bleeding with a whispered charm, or that their axes, when placed under a sicked, could draw out fever. The secrecy surrounding their methods only deepened the mystique. Unlike regular doctors, executioners rarely apprenticed their healing skills openly, passing down recipes for salves and tinctures in hushed midnight tutorials. This clandestine knowledge transfer created an aura of ancient wisdom, making villagers wonder if they could cheat death in the sick room. Perhaps they understood mysteries beyond mortal comprehension. By the time these stories reached the third or fourth telling, the executioner's bandages might morph into enchanted cloth, his bone-setting techniques into divine gifts. In the end, it was this very paradox that made their folkloric transformation possible. How could someone who set your grandmother's broken hip be purely monstrous? When the same hands that swung the axe also stitched your wounds, the line between villain and hero began to blur. Communities that once crossed themselves at an executioner's shadow now left offerings at his door: a basket of eggs for a healing draught, a loaf of bread for a pain-relieving salve. This slow, pragmatic acceptance laid the groundwork for something extraordinary. The man society called a brute was becoming, in whispered stories at least, something closer to a saint. The transformation from feared outcast to mystical folk hero didn't happen overnight. It was a slow alchemy of necessity, superstition, and the human need to make sense of the inexplicable. At the heart of this shift lay a simple truth: executioners knew things others didn't. Their work granted them an intimate understanding of death's mechanics, and in a world where mortality lurked around every corner, that knowledge took on an almost sacred quality. Villagers might flinch at the sight of an executioner's glove, but they also wondered, what secrets did those hands hold? Could someone who stood so close to the veil between worlds see beyond it? Stories began to circulate, each one adding another layer to the executioner's myth. In Bavaria, locals whispered of a hangman who predicted storms by the way a condemned man's rope twisted. In French taverns, travelers swore certain executioners could tell a liar just by the pulse in their neck, a skill honed from years of feeling the last heartbeats of the guilty. These tales weren't mere entertainment, they were attempts to explain the unexplainable. When an executioner's prediction about a failed harvest came true, it was easier to believe he had otherworldly insight than to accept life's cruel randomness. The supernatural aura extended to their tools as well. An executioner's axe, once a symbol of terror, became a relic of power in local lore. Some believed it could ward off evil spirits if hung above a doorway. Others thought its shadow could heal warts or cure madness. In Switzerland, fragments of gallows ropes were treasured as amulets against disease, while Polish legends spoke of executioners who could purify cursed land by drawing a circle with their sword. These objects, once instruments of death, were reborn as talismans, proof that even the darkest symbols could be redeemed in the imagination. What's most revealing is how these stories often carried moral weight. A recurring theme showed executioners as truth seekers, uncovering corruption or exposing hidden crimes. One popular German folktale tells of a hangman who refused to execute a weeping widow until her landlord confessed to framing her for theft. In Italy, Ballads celebrated an executioner who disguised himself as a beggar to witness a nobleman's cruelty firsthand before delivering justice. These narratives turned the executioner into society's shadow conscience, a reminder that even the powerful weren't beyond judgment. By the time these tales reached their third or fourth telling, the executioner had shed his earthly role entirely. He'd become a bridge between worlds, a figure who carried the wisdom of the dead to the living. Parents might warn children away from his cottage by day, but by night, they'd leave offerings of milk or bread at his doorstep, hoping for a blessing. The very qualities that once made him an outcast, his isolation, his intimacy with death, now made him a vessel for redemption. Fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply twisted into something far more complex, a mix of awe, gratitude, and the quiet acknowledgement that every community needs someone willing to bear its darkness so others can walk in the light. Among the most surprising twists in executioner folklore are the tales that cast them not as agents of the powerful, but as defenders of the powerless. In remote villages across Europe, oral traditions began painting these outcasts as lone guardians who stood between ordinary folk and the threats that authorities ignored. Take the story of Henk the Tall, a German executioner said to have single-handedly driven off a band of mercenaries terrorizing his town. According to legend, he didn't wield his axe, he simply tied a noose to the town gate and let the would-be raiders see it swaying in the wind. The mere suggestion of his presence sent them fleeing. What makes these protector legends so fascinating is how they often sprouted from real conflicts. Executioners occupied a unique position, close enough to power to understand its abuses, yet distant enough to sympathize with those crushed beneath it. Records from 15th century France describe a hangman named Matthew Le Goff, who secretly gathered evidence against a corrupt bailiff, using his access to prisoners to document false accusations. When the truth came out, villagers didn't credit the court or clergy. They whispered that the executioner had cut through lies like rope. Over generations, such events morphed into ballads where executioners outsmarted wicked nobles or rescued falsely accused maidens. Their feared reputation became an unlikely shield for communities. In alpine regions, parents told children that the local executioner's shadow could scare away thieves, a superstition that may have stemmed from real cases where criminals avoided villages known to have formidable hangmen. Some executioners leaned into this role, like the Polish beheader who reportedly walked the marketplace at dusk with his sword visibly strapped to his back, reducing nighttime burglaries to zero. The very traits that made society shun them their strength, their comfort with violence, suddenly made them invaluable when danger loomed. Perhaps the most poignant transformation happened in stories where executioners intervened in disputes too small for courts but large enough to destroy lives. A Scandinavian folktale tells of a hangman who settled a feud between two farmers over a stolen goat by threatening to hang the animal unless the real thief confessed. The absurdity broke the tension, leading to a truthful confession, and the goat lived. These tales didn't just redeem the executioner, they redefined justice itself, showing it could be swift, creative, and even merciful. By the time these stories reached their full mythological bloom, the executioner had shed his official role entirely. In the candlelit cottages where these legends were shared, he wasn't the king's grim tool, he was the people's last resort, a flawed but righteous figure who used his dark skills for light. Whether these protector tales were wishful thinking or based on real acts of courage hardly mattered. They gave villagers something precious, the idea that even in a world stacked against them, someone stood in the shadows, ready to balance the scales. The paradox of the executioner's curse reveals just how deeply superstition and reality intertwined in the medieval mind. On one hand, villagers believed these men carried a dark stain, that the very act of taking lives invited supernatural punishment. Whispers circulated that executioners' families were plagued by bad luck, their children born with birthmarks said to be the devil's fingerprints. Yet in the same breath, people credited them with uncanny abilities, as if their proximity to death granted them power over fate itself. A hangman's touch might wither crops or heal a fever, depending on his whim. This wasn't just fear, it was alchemy, transforming society's revulsion into something strangely sacred. One of the most enduring myths was the blood curse, the idea that harming an executioner would unleash calamity. In northern Germany, a tale spread about a nobleman who struck a hangman for insolence, only to watch his livestock perish and his orchards wither within a year. The story likely grew from a real incident, perhaps an executioner who predicted blight based on weather patterns, but in retelling, it became proof of divine retribution. What's fascinating is how these curses often served as protection for outcasts. When society offered no justice, superstition became a shield. If even the local lord feared kicking an executioner's dog, the lowest man in town gained a sliver of power. But the so-called curses had another side, blessings. Some executioners cultivated reputations as charm makers, their nooses and axes said to hold protective magic. A French legend tells of a hangman who gave a splinter from his gallows to a pregnant woman, promising it would ease childbirth. When her labor proved miraculously quick, the story spread, and soon villagers were bartering for gallows wood like holy relics. This duality, the same hand that could condemn, could also sanctify, turned executioners into walking contradictions. They weren't just men, they were forces of nature, as unpredictable and necessary as a storm. The most poignant tales blurred the line between curse and gift entirely. In the Alps, elders spoke of executioners who could see death coming, a sixth sense that let them warn villagers of impending illness or disaster. One Swiss account describes a hangman who supposedly sensed a coming avalanche days before it struck. saving an entire valley by insisting they move their livestock. Whether these stories held truth hardly mattered. What mattered was the underlying message that the very trait making someone an outcast, their intimacy with mortality, might also make them a guardian. By the time these myths solidified, the executioner had become something beyond human in the popular imagination. He was a living charm, feared and cherished in equal measure. Parents might spit over their shoulder at his approach, then leave cakes on his doorstep when plague threatened. This tension between dread and dependence birthed the cursed savior archetype, a figure who wielded darkness to keep the light safe. In the end, these superstitions weren't just about executioners. They were about communities grappling with life's hardest truth. That protection often comes from the places we least expect. Nothing captures the executioner's strange journey from pariah to participant quite like their unexpected role in village festivals. Imagine a spring fair in 16th century Bavaria, where flower garlands decorate the gallows and children laugh as the town hangman, dressed in a colorful costume rather than his usual dark robes, presides over a mock trial of winter. This wasn't mere pageantry. It was society's way of wrestling with its own contradictions. By inviting executioners into these carefully choreographed rituals, communities found a way to acknowledge their necessary horror while taming it through theater. The symbolic roles they played reveal just how deeply attitudes had shifted. In Provençal harvest festivals, executioners often portrayed the mythical green man, a nature spirit who dies and is reborn, an apt metaphor for their own social resurrection. Swiss towns had them lead the dance of death processions, guiding effigies of kings and peasants alike to symbolize life's equal end. These weren't random assignments. Placing the executioner at the heart of rituals about mortality and renewal sent a clear message. If death could be ritualized, so could its agent. Some festivals went further, turning grim reality into dark comedy. Northern German towns held fools' courts where the executioner played judge, trying villagers for absurd offenses like oversleeping or eating too much cheese. The accused faced ridiculous punishments, being pelted with rotten fruit or forced to sing off-key while the crowd roared with laughter. Beneath the merriment lay serious social alchemy. By letting people laugh at the figure who normally made them tremble, these events drained some of his terror. The most telling transformations happened in purification rites. In parts of Austria, executioners were central to New Year's ceremonies where they'd sweep out evil spirits with brooms made from gallows wood. The same hands that tied nooses now symbolically cleansed the village, their tools reborn as instruments of protection. This wasn't just acceptance, it was sacralization. When an executioner's axe was used to bless fields in Bohemian planting rituals, or his shadow was considered lucky during Spanish solstice bonfires, the line between outcast and mystic had fully blurred. What makes these festival roles so poignant is how they mirror the executioner's own duality, both destroyer and renewer, feared and necessary. By giving them ceremonial space, communities didn't erase their dark function. They made room for it in the rhythm of life. The gallows might still loom on the hill, but once a year, its keeper wore flowers in his hat and led the dancing. In that fragile balance between horror and celebration, medieval society found an unexpected truth. Sometimes the guardian of our darkest necessities deserves not just tolerance, but a place at the feast. The executioner's house stood apart in more ways than one, perched on the town's edge, its weathered timbers creaking with secrets. To villagers, these dwellings weren't just homes, they were thresholds between worlds where the echoes of last words clung to the walls like damp. In Bavaria, locals swore they heard weeping from an abandoned hangman's cottage long after its occupant died, the sobs matching the rhythm of a man who'd been executed on a rainy Tuesday. Over in Normandy, children dared each other to touch the door of the executioner's former residence, claiming the wood stayed cold even in midsummer. These weren't mere ghost stories, they were collective memories wearing supernatural disguises. What's fascinating is how these hauntings served dual purposes. On one level, they reinforced social boundaries, warning people away from the executioner's domain with tales of cursed objects and restless spirits. A common legend described silver coins left on an executioner's windowsill turning black by morning, tainted by his touch, yet the same stories often contained unexpected tenderness. In the Italian Alps, a folktale told of a wrongfully hanged man's ghost appearing not to seek revenge, but to thank the executioner who'd secretly given him a swift, painless death against orders. These nuances transformed houses of horror into complex moral landscapes where justice and mercy blurred. The most persistent legends involved executioners as mediators between the living and the dead. Welsh villagers spoke of hangmen who could quiet troublesome spirits by hanging their nooses over doorways, a macabre parallel to priests blessing homes with holy water. Some French accounts described executioners' widows performing séances, using their husbands' tools to contact the condemned for messages to loved ones. This spiritual role may have roots in reality. Many executioners did keep detailed records of prisoners' last words and requests, making them unlikely keepers of unfinished business. But the houses held darker secrets too. Cellars supposedly hid trapdoors where executioners smuggled fugitives, their knowledge of secret tunnels making them adept at sheltering the persecuted. A Bohemian ballad sings of a hangman who turned his home into a makeshift hospital during plague years, the very stones remembering how he'd burned the dead with respect when others fled. These stories didn't erase the executioner's grim function, they reframed it, suggesting that someone who lived so close to death might understand life's value most deeply. By the time these tales reached their full imaginative bloom, the executioner's dwelling had become a paradox, feared yet sacred, cursed yet protective. Parents might warn children away by day, but under a full moon, desperate souls would leave letters for lost loved ones tucked in the doorjamb, trusting the resident to deliver them across the veil. The house that symbolized society's darkest necessities had become, in folklore at least, a place where even the damned could find a strange kind of peace. Music has always been the great alchemist, turning even the darkest truths into something bearable. And nowhere is that more evident than in the folk ballads that transformed executioners from feared figures into tragic poets of the gallows. Picture a smoke-filled tavern in 17th century Germany, where a traveling minstrel strums his lute and begins a mournful tune about the hangman's lament. As the melody unfolds, the crowd leans in, hearing not a monster's tale, but a story of a man bound by duty, his heart as heavy as his axe. These weren't songs celebrating death. They were chronicles of impossible choices, where the executioner became an everyman crushed beneath the wheel of justice. The most haunting ballads played with a delicious paradox. They painted executioners as both masters and prisoners of their fate. Take the Scottish Ballad of Macgill the Just, where the title character weeps as he hangs his own brother for treason, then spends his remaining years building a chapel stone by stone as penance. Or the French chanson La Complainte du Bourreau, where the singer moans, "The rope obeys my hand, but my soul obeys the king." These songs didn't shy from the brutality of the role. They weaponized it, using graphic imagery to highlight the executioner's trapped existence. A particularly vivid verse from a Transylvanian ballad describes the hangman's shadow growing longer with each death until it swallowed the sun, a metaphor for the creeping toll of his profession. What's striking is how these ballads often rewrote history to serve moral lessons. Historical records might show a petty thief hanged without ceremony, but the folk version would have the executioner discovering the man's starving children and secretly slipping coins to their mother. The Hungarian Song of the Red Axe goes further, turning a real-life executioner into a Robin Hood figure who only hanged corrupt tax collectors. These creative liberties weren't just entertainment, they were a form of social commentary, allowing villagers to critique authority while keeping their heads safely low. The melodies themselves carried hidden meanings. Many executioner ballads used the same minor key progressions as religious hymns, subtly linking the hangman's work to divine judgment. In the Balkans, certain songs were performed in a unique time signature called the gallows rhythm, a slow, uneven beat mimicking a condemned man's final footsteps. Even the instruments held symbolism. German minstrels often used a drone string tuned to mimic the hum of a taut rope, while Italian singers accompanied these tales with the viola da braccio, whose gut strings were rumored to be made from executioners' leftover chords. By immortalizing executioners in song, ordinary people accomplished something remarkable. They gave the outcasts a voice. Where official records reduced hangmen to single-line entries, paid 6 pence for execution, ballads fleshed them out as fathers, lovers, and penitents. A particularly poignant Czech folk song describes an executioner teaching his daughter to play the harp so she might make music instead of death. These artistic flourishes didn't erase the reality of the scaffold, but they allowed communities to process it through the softening lens of art. After all, it's easier to sleep when the man who sharpens the axe also sings lullabies. She appears in the flickering torchlight of these stories like a single white flower growing at the foot of the gallows, the executioner's daughter, an enduring symbol of innocence untouched by the darkness surrounding her. Across medieval Europe's oral traditions, this young woman became folklore's great paradox, a beloved figure emerging from the most reviled household in town. In Swiss mountain villages, they told of daughters who gathered herbs at dusk to make salves for the poor, their aprons stained with healing greens rather than executioner's red. Along the Rhine, ballads sang of girls who smuggled bread to prisoners in their fathers' cells, whispering prayers as they passed the condemned. These weren't just fanciful tales, they were psychological bridges, allowing communities to approach the executioner's world through the safest possible guide, a child untainted by his deeds. What makes this archetype so fascinating is how it served dual purposes. On one level, the daughter's kindness humanized her father, reminding villagers that even the man who wielded the axe had someone waiting at home who loved him. A popular Flemish folktale describes an executioner weeping as he sharpens his blade, only for his daughter to place a flower in his tool belt, a tiny act that transforms him from monster to grieving father. But her role went deeper than softening the executioner's image. She often became the village's secret conscience, doing the charitable work others avoided. In Bohemian legends, executioners' daughters were said to wash the bodies of plague victims when even priests refused, their immunity to stigma making them society's unseen caretakers. The daughter's purity also served as narrative alchemy, transmuting the executioner's bloody tools into instruments of grace. German stories tell of girls using their father's ropes to lower food to trapped miners, or his axe to split firewood for widows. Some French tales took this further, claiming the mere presence of an executioner's daughter could bless a home, that her footsteps on a threshold would scare off evil spirits. This symbolic cleansing allowed communities to engage with the executioner's world without directly confronting its horrors. After all, if his house could produce something so good, how irredeemable could he truly be? Yet these stories often carried a sting of tragedy. Many folktales end with the daughters suffering ostracized by suitors, denied church sacraments, or dying young as martyr figures. A heartbreaking Basque legend tells of a hangman's daughter who drowns saving a noble child, only to have her corpse refused burial in consecrated ground. These bittersweet endings reveal the limits of medieval acceptance. The daughter might be cherished in stories, but real-life prejudices remained rigid. Her fictional goodness became a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its capacity for compassion and its stubborn cruelty. Perhaps the most revealing detail lies in what these daughters were never allowed to be ordinary. Whether saintly or doomed, they always existed just beyond society's edges, their lives shaped by a paradox no folklore could fully resolve. To love the daughter was to acknowledge the executioner's humanity, but to truly accept her would mean dismantling the very social order that made her father necessary. So she lingered in legend, forever caught between two worlds, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, light persists, but also that some stains, no matter how unjust, never fully wash away. The scaffold wasn't just a place of endings, it was a threshold, and in the flickering candlelight of folklore, executioners became the gatekeepers. Across medieval Europe, whispers grew that these men didn't just send souls to the afterlife, they could glimpse what lay beyond. A Bavarian chronicle from the 1500s tells of a hangman who described the final visions of the condemned with uncanny accuracy, his voice hollow as he relayed messages from the dying to their families. In Normandy, villagers swore their executioner could spot the death mark, a shadow only he could see creeping up the necks of those with less than a year to live. These weren't just ghost stories, they were attempts to rationalize the executioner's grim intimacy with mortality. If he stood so close to the veil, surely he'd peeked through it. What's remarkable is how these supernatural roles mirrored real medieval anxieties about death's unpredictability. Plague could empty a village by sunrise, battlefields left bodies unclaimed, and infant mortality was a constant specter. In this world of sudden farewells, the executioner offered something rare: certainty. His very presence became a macabre comfort. Hungarian legends speak of hangmen who kept soul ledgers, recording not just executions but the exact moment each life ended, a ritual that transformed terror into order. Some French tales went further, claiming executioners could delay death itself, bargaining with unseen forces to grant the condemned one last sunrise. These stories didn't just elevate the executioner, they made him a mediator between the chaotic world of the living and the inscrutable realm beyond. The tools of his trade took on mystical significance too. In the Scottish Highlands, gallows ropes were braided with 3 strands to mimic the Celtic belief in triple goddesses of fate, and executioners who used them were thought to bind souls safely for their journey. Swiss folklore held that an executioner's sword, if laid across a sick, could sever illness like a head from shoulders. Even the act of sharpening his blade became ritualized. Our German ballads describe hangmen whispering to their whetstones, imparting final confessions into the metal. These details reveal a profound cultural truth. Medieval societies needed to believe that death, however brutal, wasn't meaningless. The executioner's supposed supernatural gifts turned terror into ceremony, his actions threading the needle between justice and sacrament. But perhaps the most poignant tales are those where executioners become reluctant psychopomps, guides not just for the dead, but for the grieving. A Czech folktale tells of a hangman who, after executing a young mother, carves her child's name into his axe handle so her spirit might watch over the boy. In Ireland, some believed executioners could tether ghosts, using their nooses to anchor restless souls until priests arrived to bless them. This duality, destroyer and shepherd, made the executioner a walking paradox. The same hands that silenced lives could allegedly hear the whispers of those already gone. By the time these stories reached their full mystical bloom, the executioner had transcended his earthly role entirely. He wasn't just a man with an axe, he was the hinge between worlds, his shadow stretching across both sides of the grave. Communities might still shun him by daylight, but under a full moon they'd leave offerings at his door. A lock of hair from a sick child, a letter to a lost lover hoping he'd play postman to the afterlife. In the end, these supernatural legends weren't really about the executioner at all. They were about the living searching for meaning in death's echo and finding it in the unlikeliest of guides. The moment of redemption arrives not with a sword strike, but with its hesitation, a heartbeat's pause that rewrites an executioner's legacy. Across medieval folklore, these suspended instants became legendary, transforming feared figures into unlikely champions of mercy. In a Swiss Alpine tale, the hangman Klaus of Uri famously refused to behead a starving woodcutter who'd stolen a loaf of bread, instead pressing his own coins into the man's bound hands and telling the court, "Take my pay, not his life." The story spread like wildfire, not because it was common, but because it revealed what villagers longed to believe, that even the scaffold's master could defy its cruelty. These mercy narratives often followed a powerful pattern: the executioner as secret rebel. A 15th century Flemish ballad tells of a headsman who dulled his axe the night before an execution, forcing delays until new evidence spared the condemned. In Bohemia, parents whispered of a hangman's daughter who swapped the noose with a rope of braided silk, letting a falsely accused man pretend death until he could escape under cover of night. What makes these stories so compelling is their subversion of expectations, the very personification of death's inevitability becoming its cheater. The moral dilemmas at their core were anything but simple. Many tales forced executioners to choose between duty and conscience, knowing either path carried brutal consequences. One particularly haunting German legend describes a hangman who discovers the nobleman he's about to execute is actually his long-lost brother. Rather than reveal the truth and condemn his entire family to disgrace, he carries out the sentence only to carve their childhood oath into the execution block afterward as a silent testament. These weren't tidy, happy endings. They were messy, heartbreaking choices that elevated the executioner from mindless brute to tragic philosopher. Redemption sometimes came through sacrifice rather than refusal. A Provençal song recounts how an aging executioner took the place of a young thief on the gallows, whispering to the boy, "Run far and live better than I did." In the Scottish Highlands, folklore tells of a hangman who secretly served the condemned their last meal from his own table, eating nothing himself for 40 days as penance. These acts of self-denial framed the executioner's burden as a kind of sacred suffering, a weight willingly borne to spare others. What's most revealing is how these mercy tales often mirrored real legal loopholes. Historical records show some executioners did indeed exploit technicalities, declaring blades unfit or stalls unstable to delay executions until appeals could be heard. The folk versions simply amplified these small acts of humanity into grand gestures. By doing so, they answered a deep psychological need. If even the executioner could show mercy, perhaps the universe itself wasn't entirely merciless. The redemption arc's enduring power lies in its paradox. These stories didn't erase the gallows' horror. They made it bearable by suggesting that darkness could choose light. When villagers sang of the hangman who wept as he sharpened his axe or the headsman who prayed with the condemned, they weren't just spinning yarns. They were crafting a fragile hope that in a world drowning in harsh judgments, someone, even someone feared and reviled, might still have the power to say, "Enough." Crossing borders in medieval Europe meant encountering entirely new versions of the executioner's myth, each one a mirror reflecting local fears, values, and historical scars. In the misty highlands of Scotland, executioners appeared in folklore as tragic bards, their axes said to sing mournful tunes when swung, echoing the laments of the dead. One particularly haunting legend tells of a hangman who composed a melody so beautiful it made the king pardon a dozen prisoners on the spot, only for the executioner to vanish into the hills, his song lingering as a warning against tyranny. Contrast this with the sun-baked villages of southern Spain, where executioners often took on a quasi-religious aura. Folk tales describe them lighting candles for the souls they'd sent onward, their black hoods swapped for pilgrims' robes during holy festivals. The Germanic lands wove executioners into their love of order and precision. There, hangmen appeared in stories as meticulous record keepers, their ledgers noting not just names and crimes, but the weather during each execution and the last words spoken. A popular Swabian legend claims an executioner could predict the exact moment a storm would break based on how a condemned man's pulse raced. A bizarre blend of superstition and proto-scientific observation. Meanwhile, in the bustling merchant cities of northern Italy, executioner myths leaned into commerce. Tales described hangmen bargaining with death itself, offering to take two petty thieves in place of one beloved shopkeeper, their negotiations as shrewd as any marketplace deal. Eastern Europe's versions took darker, more mystical turns. Polish folklore teamed with executioners who could see death stains on those destined for the gallows, a folkloric explanation for why some criminals seemed resigned to their fate long before sentencing. Hungarian ballads sang of headsmen who doubled as vampire hunters, their axes the only weapons that could pierce a Strigoi heart. These variations weren't arbitrary, they sprang from historical traumas. After the Mongol invasions left mass graves across the region, executioners in stories became liminal figures who could navigate both the physical and spiritual aftermath of violence. Perhaps the most striking contrast emerged between France and England. French executioner tales often painted them as philosopher killers, quoting classical poetry on the scaffold. One Normandy story describes a hangman debating the nature of free will with a theologian mid-execution, his blade pausing mid-air to emphasize his points. English versions, by contrast, leaned into gallows humor. Pubs echoed with jokes about hangmen who tripped over their own nooses or accidentally pardoned the wrong man. This wasn't just cultural difference, it reflected divergent legal systems. France's centralized monarchy produced executioners as state functionaries, while England's patchwork of local courts made theirs seem more like bumbling everymen. Yet beneath these variations pulsed a universal human impulse to make sense of the unspeakable through story. Whether cast as sage, sinner, or something in between, the executioner's shifting roles revealed a truth more profound than any single legend. Societies didn't just need someone to wield the axe, they needed someone to carry the collective guilt for wielding it. The Finnish had a saying about their executioners: "A man who knows death knows life twice over." In the end, these regional myths weren't really about the hangman at all. They were about the villages that created them, stitching morality tales from the frayed edges of their own complicity. Fairy tales have always been more than simple children's stories. They're cultural fossils, preserving fragments of forgotten beliefs. And buried in some of the most familiar tales lie shadows of executioner folklore, reshaped for new audiences. Take the huntsman in Snow White, ordered to carve out the princess's heart. His last-minute mercy sparing the girl and presenting a boar's heart instead mirrors countless executioner legends where the blade's wielder becomes a secret savior. This twist isn't just narrative convenience, it echoes real medieval accounts of hangmen who falsified death certificates or helped condemned prisoners escape under cover of ritual. The huntsman's dilemma reflects a society wrestling with the same question as those villages of old. Can someone who serves death also defy it? Look closer and the connections multiply. The unnamed sponsor in Cinderella, often depicted as a fairy godmother in modern versions, originally appeared in some tellings as a mysterious old woman with uncanny knowledge of herbs and charms, much like the executioner healers of Alpine folklore. Her ability to transform rags into finery parallels tales of hangmen's daughters who wove gallows rope into protective amulets, turning tools of death into gifts of hope. Even the iconic glass slipper carries eerie resonance. In certain Swiss villages, executioners were said to measure condemned prisoners' feet for final shoes to ensure a swift, humane drop. What if Cinderella's slipper isn't just a romantic symbol, but a distant cousin to these macabre acts of precision? The influence works both ways. Just as executioner lore seeped into fairy tales, the stories shaped how people viewed real-life hangmen. When peasants heard tales like the Six Swans, where a sister endures years of silence to weave magical shirts that save her brothers from execution, they might recall the executioner's rumored ability to stitch souls back together through last-minute pardons. The archetype of the helper at the edge of the woods, a recurring fairy tale figure who aids heroes after being shunned by society, bears striking resemblance to accounts of hangmen offering shelter to fugitives in their forest cottages. Storytellers didn't just borrow details, they reframed the executioner's social exile as a source of hidden power, transforming pariahs into keepers of esoteric knowledge. What makes these parallels so compelling is how they reveal storytelling as an act of collective therapy. By embedding executioner motifs into fairy tales, with their guaranteed happy endings, communities could process their mixed feelings about these necessary outcasts. The axe becomes a magic wand, the noose a golden thread, and the hangman himself a shapeshifter who might appear as villain, helper, or even romantic lead depending on the tale's needs. In the Russian Vasilisa the Beautiful, the heroine receives a skull lantern from the witch Baba Yaga, a figure some scholars link to executioner widows who kept vigil over graves. The light guides Vasilisa safely home, just as folklore insisted executioners' lanterns could ward off evil spirits. Here, the very symbols of death are remade into beacons of survival. These narrative alchemies didn't happen by accident. They reflect a world where justice and mercy, fear and fascination were constantly negotiating. When we recognize the executioner's silhouette in these timeless stories, we're not just spotting clever references, we're witnessing how societies metabolize their darkest necessities through myth. The next time you revisit a classic fairy tale, listen for the whisper of the gallows in the wind, the shadow of the axe in the castle corridor. Some of our most enduring fantasies were born not in palaces, but at the crossroads where justice and legend collide. The executioner's axe never just fell, it spoke. In the folklore of medieval villages, every tool of the trade hummed with hidden meaning, its physical form just the shell of something far more potent. Take the blade itself, which in Swiss legends was said to sharpen itself under moonlight, its edge growing keener with each execution until it could supposedly slice through lies as cleanly as necks. Or the mask, that faceless shroud which in Bavarian tales didn't just conceal identity, it absorbed the final breath of the condemned, trapping their last words inside its stiff leather like a macabre oracle. Villagers whispered that if you pressed your ear to an old executioner's hood, you might hear echoes of confessions or prophecies uttered at the scaffold's edge. Ropes underwent the most astonishing transformation. What began as coarse hemp twisted into nooses became, in folklore, mystical bindings with power over both the living and the dead. A Flemish legend tells of a hangman's rope that unspooled itself at night to lasso wandering spirits, dragging them back to the graveyard. In the Scottish Highlands, parents tucked fragments of gallows cord into cradles, believing the fibers, steeped in death's threshold, could tie a newborn soul more securely to its body. This symbolic alchemy didn't stop at tools. Even the scaffold's wood was said to hold magic. Carpenters in Normandy avoided using oak from old execution platforms, fearing the timber retained a hunger for life that might warp floorboards or door frames. But why clothe these grim instruments in such potent symbolism? The answer lies in medieval Europe's fraught relationship with authority. The axe wasn't just steel, it was the crushing weight of the law made visible, too terrifying to confront directly. By weaving stories about enchanted blades or talking nooses, villagers could grapple with the executioner's power through metaphor rather than raw fear. A Saxon folktale captures this perfectly. When a tyrannical lord orders an innocent farmer hanged, the executioner's rope miraculously snaps 3 times, forcing the noble to admit his lie. Here, the tool itself becomes the voice of divine justice, absolving the hangman of moral responsibility while still upholding his sacred duty. The masks told their own layered story. Unlike the anonymous black hoods of later centuries, medieval executioners often wore distinctive visages, some grinning like carnival performers, others frozen in saintly serenity. These weren't just disguises, they were ritual personas, channeling archetypes older than Christianity itself. In the Harz Mountains, people spoke of a hangman whose owl-faced mask allowed him to see guilt glowing like embers in prisoners' chests. Italian frescoes depicted executioners with faces like suns and moons, aligning their work with celestial cycles. The message was clear: these men weren't mere mortals wielding tools, but vessels for forces beyond human understanding. Perhaps the most poignant transformation belonged to the executioner's cloak. Initially a practical garment, thick enough to block blood spatter, dark enough to hide stains, it became in folklore a mantle of sacred burden. A Provençal song describes a hangman's coat growing heavier with each life taken, until one day he collapses under its weight, only for angels to strip it away thread by thread as he performs acts of mercy. This motif recurs across cultures. The tools that mark their wielder as cursed also, paradoxically, purify him through service. By the time these myths solidified, the executioner's implements had transcended their original purpose entirely. An axe might still sever flesh by daylight, but by candlelight, villagers swore it could carve truth from lies. A noose could strangle, but wrapped around a sick child's wrist, it might also tether a faltering soul to life. In the end, these stories weren't about the objects themselves, but about the human need to reconcile irreconcilable truths, that the hands which brought death might also, in their own way, keep the world in balance. When the plague's shadow fell across Europe, turning bustling towns into graveyards overnight, an unlikely group stepped forward, the very people society had spent centuries shunning. Executioners, already intimate with death's mechanics, found themselves on the front lines of catastrophe, not as bringers of doom, but as reluctant saviors. While priests and physicians often fled, these outcasts dug mass graves with the same practiced efficiency they'd used to measure gallows drops, their knowledge of anatomy making them eerily adept at handling corpses without spreading contagion. In Munich's archives, a scribe's shaky handwriting records how the local hangman, one Friedrich Schmidt, single-handedly buried over 300 souls during the Black Death, using vinegar-soaked cloths to shield himself, a technique he'd learned from disinfecting execution tools. This grim heroism birthed some of the most enduring legends. In the French village of Saint-Pierre-le-Mautier, folklore tells of an executioner who noticed plague victims buried near wells kept infecting the water. Defying orders, he moved the bodies beyond the town under cover of darkness, an act that supposedly halted the outbreak. The story's likely exaggerated, but its core reveals a profound truth. Executioners understood death's logistics better than anyone. They knew how quickly a single misstep could multiply tragedy. and their brutal pragmatism, honed from years of calculating rope lengths and blade angles, made them unexpectedly effective crisis managers. Their roles expanded beyond mere grave digging. Many became enforcers of quarantine, their fearsome reputations ensuring compliance where polite requests failed. A Venetian chronicle describes a masked executioner patrolling the canals in a black gondola, his axe replaced by a lantern and bell, a spectre reminding citizens to stay indoors. In Prague, the hangman's daughter supposedly brewed a vinegar-based disinfectant from stolen church herbs, sneaking it into homes as a primitive antiseptic. These weren't just practical measures, they were acts that blurred the line between reality and myth. When survival hung by a thread, communities began seeing their executioners not as pariahs but as talismans, men already marked by death who might somehow shield others from its touch. The plague years also reshaped executioners' spiritual image. As regular clergy died or deserted, these outcasts sometimes took on quasi-religious roles. Swiss folklore speaks of hangmen who painted protective runes on doors with a mix of charcoal and holy water, merging pagan symbols with Christian rites. In Austria, villagers whispered that an executioner's shadow could purify plague-tainted air if he walked clockwise around a house 3 times. These superstitions reveal a desperate logic. If anyone had bargaining power with the Reaper, surely it was the man who worked beside him daily. What makes this chapter of their story so haunting is how it echoes their broader paradox. Just as they'd once been both healers and killers, now they were simultaneously bringers of order and omens of doom. Their very presence in a plague-stricken village signaled that death had arrived, yet their actions often kept it from spreading further. This duality seeped into art. German Dance of Death woodcuts from the era frequently show skeletal executioners leading both nobles and peasants alike, their robes now indistinguishable from the plague doctor's garb. By the time the last pestilence faded, the executioner's legend had grown new roots. The man who'd once been shunned for handling the dead was now remembered for honoring them when no one else would. Parents might still cross the street to avoid him, but they also taught children that during the Great Mortality, it was the hangman who'd carried the dying to their rest when even their families had locked the doors. In a world where death was the great leveler, the executioner had become its reluctant priest, a figure who knew better than most that survival sometimes demanded getting your hands dirty, whether with blood, medicine, or grave soil. The clatter of steam engines and the ticking of pocket watches signaled a world that no longer had room for hooded figures with axes. By the 19th century, the rise of industrialized justice, prisons with uniform sentences, private executions behind high walls slowly erased the executioner from public view. No longer did crowds gather to witness the grim theater of the scaffold. Now, death sentences were carried out in sterile courtyards, witnessed only by officials and a priest. The last generation of executioners found themselves caught between two worlds, still feared, but increasingly seen as relics of a barbaric past. In Paris, the famed Sanson dynasty, who had plied their trade for 7 generations, quietly closed their ledger after the last public guillotining in 1939, their once notorious name fading into obscurity. Yet in remote corners of Europe, the old legends clung like cobwebs in a disused attic. Alpine villagers still spoke in hushed tones of the hangman's cottage where the rightmost floorboard creaked with the voices of the condemned, even after its owner had died. In the Scottish Highlands, farmers pointed to certain twisted trees, hangman's oaks, where children dared each other to listen for whispered confessions on windy nights. These stories weren't just memories, they were a kind of folkloric afterlife where the executioner's shadow lingered long after the man himself had vanished. The tools of the trade took on new meaning in this twilight era. A guillotine blade displayed in a German museum became an object of morbid fascination, with visitors claiming it emitted a faint hum when touched. In Prague, an executioner's sword, once kept razor-sharp for beheadings, was repurposed as a ceremonial tool for cutting ribbons at town festivals, its dark history softened into pageantry. Even the language shifted. The word hangman itself, once spoken with dread, became a children's game, a punchline, anything but what it truly represented. What's most revealing is how these fading figures were recast in nostalgia. As the 20th century dawned, executioners appeared in folktales not as monsters, but as tragic wise men guarding forgotten wisdom. A Bavarian ballad from the 1920s tells of the last hangman in a village, now an old man who predicts storms by the ache in his executioner's wrist, a subtle metaphor for societal change he can sense but not stop. In Ireland, storytellers spun yarns about retired executioners who could unknot curses, their hands still nimble from decades of tying nooses. These weren't threats anymore. They were bittersweet relics, like a rusted suit of armor in a world of rifles. The true end came not with a bang, but with bureaucracy. When the British government phased out hanging in the 1960s, the official notice to executioners read like a factory layoff. Pensions offered, tools surrendered, no fanfare. Yet even then, the legends proved harder to kill than the profession itself. Today, tourists in Nuremberg pay to see the executioner's bridge, while historians debate whether it's authentic or invented for postcards. The line between fact and folklore blurs until it hardly matters, because in the end, the stories we tell about these men say more about us than them. They were the mirrors we held up to our own fears, our thirst for justice, and our uneasy relationship with power. And though the axe has rusted, the reflection remains. The executioner strides into modern storytelling with the same paradoxical power he wielded in medieval village squares. Only now, his shadow falls across cinema screens and paperback novels instead of cobblestone gallows. Take the brooding Sandor Clegane from Game of Thrones, a swordsman haunted by the burns his executioner brother inflicted, yet who finds twisted nobility in protecting the innocent. His arc, from brutal enforcer to reluctant hero, could have been lifted straight from a 15th century folktale about a hangman's redemption. Or consider the Witcher series, where Geralt of Rivia's silver sword echoes the mystical axes of legend, his role as both monster slayer and outcast mirroring the executioner's ancient duality. These aren't just cool character designs, they're folklore's fingerprints on pop culture. Literature mines these myths even deeper. Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall gives us the historical Thomas Cromwell, a man who orchestrates executions with chilling precision, yet whose interior monologues reveal the same ethical wrestling found in executioner ballads. Meanwhile, the Hangman's Daughter novels resurrect the healing archetype, casting their protagonist as a 17th century Bavarian hangman who solves crimes with his knowledge of anatomy and herbs. What makes these portrayals so compelling is their refusal to simplify. Like their folkloric ancestors, they live in the gray zone between justice and brutality. Their moral complexity, a direct inheritance from village tales where the executioner might save a life one day and take another the next. Even children's media carries traces of these legends. Howl's moving castle in Miyazaki's film, a figure both terrifying and tender, bears an uncanny resemblance to the executioner as protector myths, his fearsome exterior hiding unexpected kindness. DreamWorks' Puss in Boots: The Last Wish plays with the archetype through the wolf, an eerily calm bounty hunter whose whistling scythe and inevitability evoke the folkloric death-seer executioners who could spot a person's fate. These adaptations soften the edges for younger audiences, but the DNA remains intact. the outcast who understands life because he's intimate with death. The most fascinating transformations happen in historical fiction. Shows like the Tudors and Versailles dress their executioners in Hollywood gloss, yet keep their spiritual weight. One unforgettable scene depicts the Paris executioner Charles Sanson, a real historical figure comforting a noblewoman before her beheading, his voice gentle as he explains how to position her neck for a clean strike. It's a moment ripped from the pages of executioner memoirs where professionalism and compassion intertwined. Modern retellings grasp what medieval villagers knew instinctively, that the executioner's true power lies not in the act of killing, but in his role as witness to humanity's darkest and most vulnerable moments. Video games have turned these tropes into interactive mythology. Assassin's Creed Unity lets players meet the Sanson family during the French Revolution, their guillotine work framed as tragic necessity. Kingdom Come: Deliverance includes a hangman side quest where helping the village outcast unlocks his secret healing knowledge, a direct nod to Folklore's physician executioners. These digital recreations do more than entertain. They invite players to grapple with the same moral ambiguities that once haunted medieval villages. When you're forced to press a button to swing the executioner's axe, even virtually, you're participating in a centuries-old debate about justice and complicity. What unites all these modern interpretations is their refusal to let the executioner fade into a one-dimensional villain. Whether he's a noir detective with blood-stained gloves, a fantasy antihero, or a historical figure whispering last rites, he remains what folklore always shaped him to be, a mirror. The stories we tell about executioners then and now are ultimately stories about ourselves, our thirst for justice, and our terror of what it might cost. As long as we keep wrestling with those questions, the man with the axe will keep appearing in our narratives, his blade catching the light between myth and reality. Archaeology has a way of cutting through centuries of whispers to reveal truths as sharp as an executioner's blade. Recent excavations across Europe have unearthed graves that tell stories far richer than the myths, like the discovery of a 15th century executioner's burial in Bavaria, nestled just outside the village walls as expected, but with surprises tucked beside his bones. Among the usual tools of his trade, a well-worn axe head, a coiled rope, lay bundles of dried yarrow and comfrey, herbs long associated with wound healing. Here was tangible proof of what folklore had hinted at for generations: the executioner who doubled as a healer, his grave goods mirroring the dual life he led. Not all findings align so neatly with legend. A dig in Normandy revealed a different picture: a cramped cottage where an executioner's family lived, its floor littered with children's toys and broken pottery. The mundane reality of spilled ink in his ledger, recording payments for rat catching alongside executions, paints a portrait not of a mystical figure, but a working-class man juggling gruesome duties and everyday struggles. His boots, preserved in the damp soil, showed careful repairs. Even the hand that swung the axe needed to cobble soles to keep his children's feet dry. These artifacts whisper a truth often lost in folklore. For every moment of supernatural reverence, there were years of scraping by on the fringes of respectability. Some discoveries actively contradict the stereotypes. In Switzerland, archaeologists uncovered an executioner's home improbably located near the town square, not banished to the outskirts as law dictated. Charred receipts in the hearth revealed he traded freely with butchers and bakers, his social exile more flexible than records suggested. Elsewhere, a set of finely carved chess pieces found in a German hangman's grave hinted at a mind sharpened by strategy and leisure, not just grim routine. These nuances force us to reconsider the black and white image of the outcast. Perhaps some communities bent the rules, finding pragmatic ways to coexist with the man they needed but feared to acknowledge. The most poignant revelations come from personal items. A pendant excavated in Austria, a tiny silver axe dangling beside a Madonna, captures the executioner's spiritual dilemma in miniature. Was it a plea for forgiveness, a badge of pride, or both? In Poland, a rusted ring inscribed, "I serve justice, not cruelty," in nearly faded letters suggests these men grappled with their roles in ways folklore rarely explored. Even their tools tell revised stories. A Danish executioner's sword, analyzed for trace metals, showed it was deliberately blunted for all but fatal strikes, physical evidence of the mercy tales passed down through generations. What emerges from the dirt isn't just a correction to the historical record, but a bridge between legend and reality. The herbs in the Bavarian grave confirm the healer myths, while the Normandy toys remind us that behind every dark archetype stood a parent rocking a cradle. Archaeology doesn't erase the executioner's mystique. It deepens it, revealing layers of humanity beneath the hood. Each shard of pottery, each mended boot, whispers the same truth. These were men who walked the line between the world that shunned them and the stories that couldn't let them go. Executioners didn't just exist on the fringes of society, they held up a mirror to its deepest contradictions. Their folklore, rich with themes of exclusion and unexpected redemption, reveals how communities grappled with the very idea of belonging. Consider the recurring motif of the executioner who saves a village from plague or stops a corrupt noble. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're blueprints for how marginalized figures can rewrite their own narratives. In the Swiss tale of Klaus the Steadfast, the hangman uses his knowledge of anatomy to expose a false confession, freeing an innocent farmer. The villagers don't thank him openly, they leave gifts at his doorstep under cover of darkness. This duality captures a universal truth. Societies often rely on those they officially shun, celebrating them in secret while maintaining public disdain. The executioner's transformation in folklore also exposes the fluidity of justice itself. Medieval villages, with their limited legal systems, frequently saw power abused by local elites. Executioner myths became a safe way to critique this imbalance. A Baltic legend tells of a hangman who refuses to execute a starving thief until the wealthy merchant who withheld the man's wages is brought to trial. The story spread not because it was common, but because it voiced a collective longing for accountability. These narratives allowed peasants to imagine a world where the lowest member of society could humble the highest, a fantasy as potent then as viral. David V.S. Goliath stories are today. What makes these tales especially poignant is their focus on small, humanizing details. Hungarian ballads describe executioners mending toys for orphaned children of the condemned. French folktales speak of hangmen who plant flowers at unmarked graves. These gestures, tiny rebellions against dehumanization, reflect a broader cultural instinct to find glimmers of grace in the grimmest corners. Modern parallels are everywhere. Think of prison hospice volunteers or former gang members mediating street conflicts. Like their folkloric counterparts, these individuals are often dismissed until their unique proximity to suffering makes them indispensable guides through it. The executioner's folklore also probes the cost of bearing society's darkness. A recurring Alpine myth warns that hangmen who show too much compassion develop visible cracks in their skin, their bodies literalizing the moral fractures of their role. This metaphor resonates eerily with contemporary discussions about trauma in first responders or social workers. Both then and now, there's recognition that those who handle collective pain absorb its weight in ways that mark them sometimes physically, always psychologically. The difference, where medieval villagers saw cracks as supernatural signs, we might diagnose PTSD but the underlying truth remains. Doing necessary but stigmatized work changes a person. Perhaps the most striking lesson lies in how these stories evolve. Early tales emphasize the executioner's isolation, but later versions increasingly show communities finding oblique ways to include him. A German harvest festival might accidentally leave an extra sheaf of wheat by his cottage. Italian children might dare each other to touch his cloak for luck, their fear mingling with fascination. These small acts hint at a hard truth societies still wrestle with: that redemption isn't just about the marginalized proving their worth, but about the privileged confronting their own complicity in exclusion. Today, as debates swirl about reintegrating former convicts or welcoming refugees, the executioner's folklore offers an unexpected roadmap. His stories remind us that belonging isn't a switch flipped by one heroic act, but a slow alchemy of whispered gratitude, pragmatic reliance, and the quiet courage of those who keep showing up despite rejection. The hangman's journey from pariah to folk hero wasn't about erasing his past. It was about expanding the community's imagination until there was space, however precarious, for even the most stained hands to contribute. In that tension between fear and need, between judgment and dependence, lies a truth as sharp as any blade. No society can afford to waste its outcasts, because sometimes the very traits that make someone an exile also make them a savior. History loves its paradoxes, and few are sharper than the woman who wielded the axe when no one else would. While executioner folklore overwhelmingly centers on men, scattered records and hushed legends reveal a startling truth: women did this work too, their stories buried under layers of societal discomfort. Take the case of Madame la Guillotine, a nickname given not to the infamous French device, but to a shadowy figure in Lyon who allegedly took over her husband's duties in the 1700s, her identity concealed behind the same black veil as male colleagues. Or the cryptic guild ledger from 15th century Frankfurt that lists a martyr the stropper paid for 6 executions, her title a crude reference to rope work. These weren't mythical constructs, they were flesh and blood women navigating one of history's most reviled professions. What makes their exclusion from folklore so telling is how it clashes with reality. In an era when women were barred from most professions, execution remained bizarrely egalitarian. If you had the stomach for it, the job was yours. Some stepped in when male relatives died mid-sentence, like the Bavarian widow Anna Pfeiffer, who in 1622 completed her husband's contract rather than forfeit their home. Others inherited the role through matrilineal guild traditions, particularly in parts of Italy where executioner families intermarried to keep the trade contained. Yet their near-total absence from ballads and village tales speaks volumes about who got to shape history's narrative. The few female executioners who do appear in legends are often distorted into grotesques or sorceresses. A Saxon folktale warns of Bloody Greta, a hangwoman who supposedly bathed in victims' tears to stay young, a far cry from the dignified portrayals of male executioners as wise healers. Contrast this with the real-life Sister Hangman of Prague, a nun documented in convent records for secretly assisting the city's executioner during plague years, her medical knowledge saving countless lives between sentences. The disparity reveals a cultural blind spot. Medieval societies could romanticize a man bearing the burden of justice, but a woman doing the same unsettled fundamental notions of femininity. Yet traces of their influence linger in unexpected places. Some scholars argue that fairy tale figures like the wicked stepmother with her poisoned apples or the old woman who demands Snow White's heart are warped echoes of executioner women, society's way of reconciling female power over life and death through horror tropes. Even the trope of the hag who knows herb lore may stem from real female executioners' medicinal roles, their knowledge recast as witchcraft once the gallows were out of frame. The most subversive stories emerge where you'd least expect them. In a Swiss alpine village, grandmothers still recount the tale of red-hooded Hannah, a hangman's daughter who took over his duties and famously spared a shepherd boy by swapping his noose with a rope of braided flowers. Unlike male mercy legends, Hannah's story emphasizes maternal instinct. She doesn't debate ethics like philosophical hangmen, but acts on pure compassion. Similarly, Baltic folklore preserves fragments of the Quiet Widow, a woman who supposedly executed so precisely that the dying felt only a mother's kiss. These rare narratives don't just add missing voices, they expand our understanding of how justice was gendered and who was allowed to temper it with humanity. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues too. A grave in Saxony, long assumed to hold a male executioner based on its axe burial, was recently re-examined through osteological testing. The skeleton's pelvic structure revealed a woman in her 40s, her bones showing the same muscular stress patterns as her male counterparts. Beside her lay not just tools but a child's wooden toy, a quiet testament to the duality these women balanced. Another dig in Normandy uncovered a small silver ring inscribed "Justice has no master" inside a female executioner's coffin, suggesting some wore their office with defiant pride. The erasure of these women matters because it distorts our view of medieval society's complexities. When we picture only men on the scaffold, we accept a hierarchy that likely didn't exist so neatly. Their absence from folklore isn't proof they weren't feared or revered, but rather that their stories threatened the era's fragile myths about gender. After all, if a woman could wield the axe without losing her humanity, or worse, do it with unique empathy, what did that say about the men who'd built entire systems to keep her powerless? The silence speaks as loudly as any confession forced in the executioner's chamber. The executioner's oath was never just a vow to the crown. It was a bargain with his own conscience, a knot tightening with every life he took. Legends from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sunburnt plains of Spain return again and again to this paradox, the man bound by duty yet haunted by its weight. Take the tale of Klaus of the Iron Heart, a German folktale's protagonist who sharpens his blade each night not to prepare for the next execution, but to study his reflection in the steel, asking it the same relentless question: when justice wears the mask of cruelty, who truly wields the axe? These stories peel back the hood to reveal an unexpected philosopher. In one Swiss alpine ballad, the executioner Marcus the Thoughtful keeps a ledger where he records not just names and crimes, but the weather on the day of each hanging, as if tracking whether the heavens approve. His nightly ritual involves weighing the coins paid for his services against a feather from a songbird's wing, a poetic reckoning of blood money against the fragility of life. This wasn't just medieval melodrama, it was a raw exploration of moral arithmetic, forcing audiences to confront whether any wage could compensate for extinguishing a soul. The tension between free will and fate plays out in chilling detail. A Hungarian legend describes an executioner who discovers his next victim is the same beggar who shared bread with him years earlier. The tale lingers not on the execution itself, but on the agonizing night before, where the hangman paces his cottage, debating whether to flee and damn himself or stay and damn his conscience. What makes these narratives so gripping is their refusal to offer easy answers. Unlike knights or kings, the executioner couldn't cloak his violence in glory. His work was intimate, messy, and irrevocable. Some legends weaponize this existential dread. A Flemish folktale tells of a hangman who carves symbols into his axe handle, one notch for every execution where he doubted the sentence. When the notches outnumber the unmarked wood, the weapon supposedly shatters of its own accord, a supernatural rebuke to blind obedience. Other stories invert expectations entirely, like the Italian Ballad of the Silent Judge, where an executioner stops mid-swing to demand the sentencing magistrate trade places with the condemned. "If this is justice," he growls, "let your hands bear its weight." The most profound tales explore redemption through small acts of defiance. A Czech story recounts an executioner who, forbidden by law to attend church, spends Sunday mornings planting oaks along the road to the gallows. Decades later, the trees form a shaded path where the condemned can walk in cool respite before meeting the sun's glare on the scaffold. This quiet subversion, turning instruments of death into sources of comfort, captures the executioner's struggle perfectly, unable to refuse his role but determined to humanize it. What these legends ultimately reveal is a medieval world wrestling with questions we still face today. Can systems absolve individuals of moral responsibility? Does obedience excuse complicity? By casting the executioner as both perpetrator and prisoner, folklore forced societies to stare into the abyss of their own collective violence. The axe might fall by one man's hand, but its shadow stretched over every citizen who benefited from the order it upheld. In the end, these stories weren't about the executioner's dilemma. They were a mirror held up to the audience, asking who among them would have the courage to dull the blade. Executioners never walked alone in folklore. Even when human society shunned them, the animal kingdom kept them strange company. Across medieval Europe, tales wove creatures into the hangman's shadow, each beast reflecting a different facet of his paradoxical role. In the foggy moors of Scotland, executioners were said to be trailed by silent black hounds with eyes like smoldering coals, their presence warning of impending doom. Yet these weren't mindless monsters. Legends claimed the dogs would howl only for the truly guilty, their eerie cries serving as a supernatural jury. Meanwhile, in the forests of Bavaria, ravens perched on executioners' shoulders like feathered familiars, whispering the sins of the condemned into their ears. These birds weren't just symbols of death, they were omniscient witnesses, their jet-black feathers absorbing secrets too dark for human tongues. But the animal lore didn't stop at ominous companions. Strangely tender tales abound of executioners as healers of beasts, a twist that softened their fearsome image. A Flemish ballad sings of a hangman who splintered the broken wing of a crow, only for the bird to later lead him to evidence exonerating an innocent man. In the Swiss Alps, grandmothers told children of executioners who sheltered injured wolves, their knowledge of anatomy making them unlikely veterinarians. These stories served a sly purpose. If even the fiercest predator trusted the hangman's touch, perhaps villagers could too. The imagery was potent. A man who wielded an axe by day might cradle a wounded fawn at dusk, his hands capable of harm and healing in equal measure. Some creatures blurred the line between natural and supernatural entirely. Bohemian folklore spoke of executioners' horses that could find their way home from any distance, even with their riders blindfolded, as if the beasts shared their master's uncanny connection to the unseen. In Normandy, cats born in executioners' cottages were said to steal the breath of the wicked in their sleep, becoming spectral enforcers of karma. These weren't mere pets. They were extensions of the executioner's liminal power, navigating both the physical world and the murky realms beyond. The most fascinating tales involve transformations. A chilling Saxon legend tells of an executioner cursed to become a stag after showing mercy, his antlers growing heavier with each passing year like the weight of his unshed blood. Conversely, a tender Italian story describes a hangman's daughter who turns into a nightingale to escape her tainted name, her song lifting the souls of the condemned. These metamorphoses reveal folklore's deepest obsession, the idea that those who danced with death daily weren't entirely human themselves. Whether as guardians, healers, or avengers, the animals in these stories didn't just accompany executioners. They completed them, stitching the outcast into the fabric of the natural order in ways society never could. What makes these animal bonds so poignant is their mutuality. While humans crossed the street to avoid executioners, creatures approached without prejudice. A Hungarian folktale captures this perfectly. When a hangman rescues a half-drowned fox, the animal repays him by digging up a lost wedding ring from a grave, proof that even the most reviled man could earn loyalty where he least expected it. In the end, these legends weren't just about symbolism, they were about solace. For a figure condemned to loneliness, the silent understanding of a dog or the weightless trust of a healed sparrow might have been the only kindnesses he knew. And so folklore gave executioners what life often denied companions, who saw not the blood on their hands, but the heart beneath the hood. Festivals celebrating executioners might seem like macabre affairs at first glance, but step into the cobblestone streets of a Bavarian village during the annual Hangman's Day, and you'll find something far more nuanced. The air hums with music from lutes carved to resemble miniature gallows, while children giggle as they are sentenced to eat oversized pretzels by a jovial actor in a historically accurate leather hood. These events aren't morbid spectacles, they're living tapestries where history, shame, and pride intertwine. In the French town of Saint-Pierre-la-Moutier, locals reenact their legendary executioners' plague-era heroism with solemn torchlight processions, participants carrying symbolic bundles of herbs he supposedly used to purify infected homes. What begins as performance often bleeds into catharsis. Descendants of executioner families sometimes emerge from the crowd to share ancestral stories, their voices trembling with generations-old emotion. The rituals vary wildly by region, each revealing how communities process their complex relationships with these figures. Swiss alpine villages host gallows feasts, where participants take turns lowering a dummy from a reconstructed scaffold, not to glorify violence, but to demonstrate the precision required for a clean execution. In Poland, the Dancing with Death festival features executioners waltzing with villagers in elaborate skeleton costumes, a tradition rooted in medieval dances meant to symbolize life's fragility. The most striking transformations happen in Nuremberg, where the annual Meister Franz market turns the executioner's former residence into a bustling fairground. Stalls sell healing salves based on historical recipes, while actors perform folk tales where the hangman outsmarts corrupt nobles, a far cry from the silent brute of official records. What makes these revivals so powerful is how they reclaim narrative control. For centuries, executioners appeared in documents only as instruments of authority, their humanity erased by bureaucratic shorthand. But in the cobbled squares of Český Krumlov, when a black-clad reenactor pauses mid-script to describe how the real 16th century executioner Jakub Kajacin secretly taught orphans to read, history breathes again. These festivals don't whitewash the past. Many include somber moments where names of the executed are read aloud, but they allow communities to confront hard truths through the softening lens of time, acknowledging that the man who carried out sentences was often as trapped by them as those he condemned. The symbolism woven into these events speaks volumes. In Italy's Tuscan hills, participants in the Festa del Boia wear half-black, half-white masks representing the executioner's duality. Spanish towns incorporate rope-weaving contests, where intricate knots symbolize the tension between justice and mercy. Perhaps most moving are the German Light the Shadows processions, where lanterns shaped like axes are placed along old execution sites, illuminating what was once hidden in shame. These aren't just tourist attractions, they're acts of collective memory therapy, allowing towns to integrate chapters they'd rather forget into their identity. Scholars note an intriguing pattern. Festivals flourish most where historical executioner families actually lived. In Prague's lesser-known Alchemist's Alley, descendants of the city's last executioner still run a tavern where patrons can examine their ancestors' pardon ledger over mugs of hangman's ale. The brewhouse walls display generations of family portraits, ordinary faces that defy the monstrous stereotypes. This personal connection transforms festivals from abstract history lessons into living conversations. When a great-great-granddaughter in Austria steps onto a festival stage to sing a ballad from her executioner ancestor's handwritten songbook, the past stops being theoretical. The ripple effects extend beyond nostalgia. Some towns have leveraged these festivals to fund preservation of executioner-related sites that were nearly lost. In France, proceeds from the Shadow of the Scaffold festival restored a rare surviving executioner's garden where medicinal herbs still grow between the cobblestones. Other communities use the events to spark dialogue about modern justice. Norwegian organizers recently paired their Swords to Plowshares festival with seminars on criminal justice reform, drawing unexpected parallels between medieval scapegoating and contemporary incarceration rates. As dusk falls on these gatherings, something remarkable often happens. The masks slip, the scripts are set aside, and people gather spontaneously around fire pits to share stories passed down through their families, not just about executioners, but about the weavers who supplied their ropes, the bakers who fed them, the neighbors who secretly sought their help. In these unplanned moments, festivals achieve their deepest purpose, reminding us that history's outcasts were never truly separate from the communities that needed them. The laughter ringing through the night air carries an unspoken acknowledgement that every society has its necessary shadows, and perhaps honoring them honestly is the first step toward stepping into the light. The human mind has a remarkable ability to reshape what terrifies us into something we can bear, even revere. Psychologists call this phenomenon mythic transformation, where figures that trigger our deepest fears are reinvented through folklore as protectors or wise guides. The executioner's journey from social outcast to folk hero isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a masterclass in collective psychological coping. When medieval villagers whispered stories about hangmen who could heal with a touch or predict storms by the creak of their gallows, they weren't merely spinning tales. They were performing mental alchemy, converting the leaden weight of dread into the gold of admiration. This transformation follows a recognizable psychological pattern seen across cultures. Anthropologists observe similar processes with other feared roles, undertakers becoming spiritual guides in West African traditions, or warriors morphing into guardian deities in Japanese folklore. The executioner's case stands out because his redemption was so improbable. Here was a man literally drenched in society's violence, yet through stories, he became the village's unlikely moral compass. Cognitive dissonance theory explains part of this shift. When people depend on someone they're taught to despise, the tension becomes unbearable unless they reframe their perception. Those midnight visits to the executioner's cottage for bone setting or plague remedies created cognitive cracks that folklore rushed to fill with narratives of secret virtue. The stories also served as psychological safety valves. Terror management theory suggests humans buffer existential fears by creating cultural narratives that impose order on chaos. What could be more chaotic than a figure who embodies mortality itself? By imagining executioners with supernatural control over death, able to delay it, foresee it, or even bargain with it, villagers replaced helplessness with a comforting illusion of mastery. A Hungarian legend where the hangman spots death marks on those fated for the gallows isn't just a spooky tale. It's psychological armor against life's randomness, implying anyone, understands the rules of the game. Evolutionary psychology offers another lens. Our brains are wired to pay obsessive attention to potential threats, a legacy from ancestors who survived by spotting predators. But constant vigilance is exhausting. The executioner's folkloric makeover allowed communities to keep this threatening figure in view while dialing down the fear response. German children playing hangman's tag or Italian newlyweds seeking an executioner's blessing were engaging in systemic desensitization, making the once terrifying familiar through ritual and story. Modern parallels abound. Think of how pirates morphed from murderous criminals into romantic rogues in popular culture, or how Grim Reaper imagery adorns baby onesies as a playful nod to mortality. Even today's true crime fascination follows this same psychological blueprint. We compulsively revisit our darkest fears through narratives that promise resolution or meaning. The executioner's legends were medieval Europe's true crime genre, satisfying the same primal need to stare into the abyss but with the reassurance of folkloric structure. What makes these transformations so enduring is their emotional layering. The best executioner myths don't erase the character's darkness, they complicate it. Swiss tales of hangmen who weep while sharpening their axes, or French ballads about executioners planting roses at unmarked graves, create psychological depth that simple villainy could never achieve. This nuanced storytelling activates what neuroscientists call the paradox of negative emotion, our strange capacity to enjoy sad or frightening stories because they help process real-life emotions in a controlled setting. When villagers sang about the executioner's hidden sorrows, they weren't just entertaining each other, they were rehearsing how to live with their own moral ambiguities in a harsh world. The executioner's folkloric rebirth reveals a profound truth about human psychology. We don't just tell stories to escape reality, but to reshape it. By turning the axe wielder into a healer, the hooded stranger into a sage, medieval communities performed collective therapy on themselves. These narratives didn't change the executioner's reality. He still lived outside the town walls. His hands still bore the stains of his office. But they changed how people could bear his existence, and by extension, how they could bear the uncomfortable truths he represented about justice, mortality, and their own complicity in both. In that alchemy of fear and fascination, we see storytelling's oldest magic, the power to remake monsters into mirrors, showing us not just who we fear, but who we aspire to be. From the scaffold to the storyteller's fire, executioners didn't just fade into history, they were reinvented, their legacy reshaped by the very communities that once shunned them. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was a cultural survival mechanism, a way to make peace with the necessary darkness at the edges of society. Consider the German folktale of the executioner who planted an oak sapling for every life he took, the trees eventually forming a shaded grove where villagers picnicked. What began as one man's penance became a shared sanctuary, the very symbol of death repurposed into a gift of life. This duality lies at the heart of executioner lore, the recognition that those who bear society's burdens often hold unexpected wisdom. These stories endure because they grapple with timeless tensions. The executioner's journey from pariah to protector mirrors our own struggles with morality, justice, and redemption. Take the Swiss legend of the hangman who refused to execute a starving mother, secretly helping her escape, a tale that forces us to confront the collision of law and compassion. Or the Bohemian ballad where an executioner's daughter heals a nobleman's son with herbs gathered from the gallows' shadow, proving that grace can flourish in the unlikeliest soil. These narratives didn't just humanize the executioner, they held up a mirror to society's contradictions, asking who the real monsters were. What makes these legends so resonant today is their raw exploration of marginalization. The executioner's folklore is at its core a story about outsiders, people branded by their roles yet refusing to be defined by them. In an age where stigma still shapes lives, these tales offer a peculiar comfort, the idea that even the most reviled can rewrite their stories. The French executioner who becomes a folk healer, the Polish headsman who shelters refugees. These characters remind us that identity isn't fixed, that redemption is always possible, even when carved from the hardest wood. The power of these stories lies in their refusal to simplify. They don't absolve the executioner's grim work, but they complicate it, layering his narrative with moments of defiance, mercy, and unexpected beauty. Like the Spanish legend of the hangman who wore a cloak stitched from pardons denied, each torn scrap representing a life he couldn't save, they acknowledge the weight of impossible choices. This emotional honesty is why these tales still captivate us centuries later. They're not fairy tales with neat endings, but messy, haunting parables about the cost of justice and the fragility of belonging. As the embers of these stories glow in the modern imagination, they challenge us to reconsider who gets labeled as monsters and why. The executioner's axe may have rusted, but the questions these legends raise still cut deep. How do we treat those who do our dirty work? Can we separate the deed from the doer? And when the stories fade, what remains of the lives they were built upon? Perhaps the true magic of these tales isn't in their supernatural flourishes, but in their stubborn insistence that even in history's darkest corners, humanity persists, waiting to be unearthed by those willing to listen. So tell us which of these forgotten legends lingers in your mind: the healer with blood-stained hands, the protector who walked the gallows path. Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to join us next time as we keep unearthing history's hidden tales, one shadow at a time.